Okay, so what have we done so far? I've suggested that philosophy is the activity of working out the right way to think about things, and then in the last section we were concerned with trying to articulate a sense in which philosophical inquiry or philosophical questions might be fundamental. And I suggested that that was the sense in which they weren't questions that you could escape from. Okay? Even if you're not concerned with actually answering them or addressing them, they're still there to be addressed. Okay. Now in this section I want to think about whether or not philosophy is important. Okay. So you might agree that philosophy is fundamental in the sense that we've just been concerned with, in that we can't escape from it. But it seems that just agreeing with that isn't enough to force you to agree that it's important. So you might think that there are much more important things to do, like getting the dinner cooked and getting the dishes done, than spending a lot of time worrying about what the right questions to ask are, and spending time asking questions about questions and working out the right way to think about everything. That might just not be something that it's important for you to do. But this is interesting because, as well as saying that philosophical questions or philosophical inquiry is fundamental, when philosophers are trying to characterize what they think philosophy is, important is another word that they often reach for. They think that philosophy is not just concerned with any set of questions about us and our lives, but it's concerned with questions that are somehow important in some interesting sense. So I want to spend this section trying to get a bit clearer on what that sense of importance might be. There's a sense in which, again, I don't agree that just any philosophical question, just by dint of being philosophical, is important. So given that I think that philosophy is just the activity of working out the right way of thinking about things, there are all sorts of things that we can think about in right or wrong ways that might not be very important at all. Remember, in the last section we considered skepticism about whether or not my jumper exists, and we suggested that that doesn't seem to be a question that people should spend much time worrying about. There might be all sorts of other questions about how we should think about jumpers that just don't seem important enough to worry about. So I could write a book, for example, about when an object is or isn't a jumper, and in doing that I'd be involved in trying to work out the right way of thinking about jumpers. So I'd be doing the philosophy of jumpers. Now it seems ridiculous to say that just because that is an activity that's philosophical, that is somehow important. So I think if we do think that philosophical questions or philosophical inquiry is distinctive in being important in some special way, we've got to say a bit more about what that is. So let's spend some time trying to explore that. This activity of working out what the right way of thinking about some topic or issue is, why should that be important? Well, we've just seen some reasons to think that philosophy often is important, because we've seen in the last video that it's often, and perhaps ideally I'm going to suggest shortly, concerned with getting a clear view of the things that matter most to us. Remember in the last video when we were thinking about the initial reactions we might have to an epistemologist's or a skeptic's concerns about whether or not my jumper really exists. We might just not think that those questions really matter to us. Okay? But then we suggested that in order to properly justify that, we're going to have to say something about why that is. We're going to have to say something about what questions do matter. Okay, so part of what we saw there is that often we have this sense of what's important that we haven't fully articulated to ourselves. So we can have a sense of what's important without that being something that we've yet put into words or argued for. But oftentimes in doing philosophy, that's just what we're striving to do, right? We're striving to get a clear view of the question or the topic that's motivating us, and in doing so, hopefully we'll come to understand something about why or whether that topic really matters. Here's a quote from Isaiah Berlin trying to explain what he thinks is important about philosophy. He says, "People cannot live without seeking to describe and explain the universe to themselves. The models they use in doing this must deeply affect their lives, not least when they are unconscious. Much of their misery and frustration is due to the mechanical and unconscious, as well as deliberate, application of models where they do not work. The goal of philosophy is always the same, to assist people to understand themselves, and thus operate in the open and not wildly in the dark." What Berlin's saying in this quote is that we have ways of understanding ourselves, or thinking about ourselves, that we can employ more or less clearly, and that also can be better or worse for us. So that's one way in which you might think that philosophy is important. And a last way is you might think that it's important because it teaches us not to go along with accepted wisdom, or not to go along with the justifications for some course of action without examining them. And it helps us to acquire the skills to do a good job of examining them. So, 3 suggestions about a distinctive sort of importance that philosophical inquiry might have. The first one we inherited from the last section. Okay, we saw that oftentimes philosophical inquiry is going to be trying to articulate or clarify some topic or matter that we think is important to us in some special or profound sense. Second sense we got from Berlin's quote, philosophical inquiry might be important in shedding light on ways of thinking about or understanding ourselves that we have, and working out whether or not we're using those ways clearly and whether or not those ways are the best ones for the job. And lastly, I've just suggested that something that's important about philosophical inquiry might be giving us the skills and the predisposition to question dogma that might not be good for us. So let's try and see if we can tie these 3 ways together to say something unified about the importance of philosophical inquiry. The sort of critical reasoning and thinking that we engage in when we do philosophy can help us to get this clearer view. Now, what we learned from the Berlin quote is that one way that our view can be obscured is by our unthinkingly, or perhaps unconsciously, adopting particular ways of understanding ourselves or of conducting our lives. For example, this might be a result of just accepting things that you were told whilst being brought up, or just going along with the practices of society that you happen to live in. Perhaps you suddenly realise that your whole life until now has been driven by the acquisition of money and material goods, and you've never actually stopped to think about whether or not that's what you really want out of life. So if you came to a realisation like that, it seems like the right thing to do then is to step back and ask questions about the presuppositions of your life that you've just noticed. Does this really reflect what you think is the right way of understanding yourself? Is this really the right way of thinking about what you want out of life? Now, even if you step back and reflect on that, reflect on whether or not the acquisition of money and material goods is what you really want out of life, and the answer is yes. Yes, it is. That is a true and accurate reflection of who I am and what I want from life. Then you might still think that there's been something important and valuable about that process of reflection. You might think that you're better off for having reflected on the question and justified your stance to yourself. You've come to a deeper and richer understanding of who you are and why you are like that. Stepping back and thinking about these presuppositions and working out whether or not they reflect what you think is the right way of understanding things involves what I've been suggesting, the activity that defines philosophy. I'd like to add a little bit to my earlier definition of philosophy. At the end of the first section, I suggested that philosophy was the activity of working out the right way of thinking about things. But then remember at the start of this section, I suggested that just by stepping back and working out the right way of thinking about things, it's not guaranteed that you're going to be thinking about something important or addressing important questions. So now I'd like to add that the most important or worthwhile philosophy is the activity of working out the right way of thinking about things that matter most to us.